Chapter 3. He was led upstairs into the small, shabby apartment, and Dean couldn't help but notice the stuffy smell the main room gave off. No matter how many windows were opened in an attempt to waft the stale scent away, it lingered in the air like the door had been closed weeks ago and everyone forgot to open it again. Like something had died and wasted away without anyone noticing. The apartment was strange, but Dean found himself oddly comfortable in it. It was the home of a man who had more important things to do than stick around and decorate. On the wall was covered in a maroon and gold wallpaper, while the wall directly opposite had floral patterned black and white wallpaper, on which someone had drawn a smiley face in dripping yellow paint. There was a black leather couch on this wall, but the rest of the room was empty, except for dozens of cardboard boxes that were filled to the brim with the assorted small necessities of living. Dean thought he saw a skull in one of them, too. "Tea?" the other man asked, already starting towards the bluish-colored kitchen. No," Dean said, shifting around a bit. Not sure whether or not to sit down. He decided to sit. "Thanks." "Well, I'd like some tea," the other man said, putting the kettle on. "My name is John, by the way." "Dean." John pulled one of the chairs from the kitchen into the main room and sat down opposite Dean. Dean hinted a sort of familiarity in the way John did this, like it was a process he'd executed hundreds of times. "Sorry about the mess," he said, nodding towards the boxes. "Moving out?" Dean asked awkwardly, but John didn't answer. He just stared. There was something about that stare. Fixated, calm, calculating. He looked you in the eye when you spoke, never relenting. The look in his eyes was the same one Dean saw every day when he looked in the mirror, the look of a soldier. He looked around the room again, trying to avoid the stare. "So, is Sherlock coming back any time soon?" "No," John answered almost immediately. He averted his eyes to the floor. He's dead." Dean felt his breath hitch into his throat. "Excuse me?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Has been for some months now," John went on. The strong look in his eyes was somewhat weaker than it was before when he looked back at Dean. No, see, he can't be dead," Dean said, leaning forward and wiping his palm down his mouth. "This guy was kind of my last hope here." "You said you wanted Sherlock to find the doctor," John said. "That would make the doctor your last hope." "Yeah, so I can get you the doctor," John said flatly. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone and looked down at it. "Last time I met the doctor, he was fond of Sherlock, but he gave me his mobile number, just in case we ever needed his help." "Why you?" Dean asked. John looked up at him and gave a soft, breathy chuckle. "You never met Sherlock." He looked back at his phone in his hands, and then sat upright again. "Anyway, I'm not going to give it to you, not until you tell me why you need him." Dean felt a headache coming on. "Why not?" he barked. John crossed his legs and fixed Dean with another stare. "Because you can't know about the doctor. You can't," he said. "No one knows about the doctor. No one in their right mind, anyways." Dean didn't know what that meant, but he assumed this doctor was part of the life. He was a hunter. Did that mean John knew all about all the monsters that go bump in the night? Did the doctor save John from something once? "Yeah, well, who says I'm in my right mind?" Dean forced a smile onto his face. John blinked at him. "Look," Dean said pointedly, "the fact is I know about him, and I need him. He's supposed to be an expert in the downright freaky, right? I get it. It's all hush-hush, but my brother was taken by something called a weeping angel, and I've never seen anything like it before." Dean noticed that he was now giving him a strange look, one of controlled fear twinkling in his eyes. It was the first time Dean saw the man change his stony expression. "Hold on, did you just say the weeping angels?" John asked, unfolding his legs and leaning slightly forward. "So you've seen him?" John didn't answer. He looked back down at his phone, scrolled through the contacts, and held it up to his ear. The planet Cribus, the Mintica star system, Orion's belt. Earth date, January 4th, 5380. Gunshots rang out behind them as they ran through the corridors, careful not to knock over any priceless works of art, and trying to dodge every clear glass stand that housed an ancient artifact from a year of centuries into Rory's future. Not like it matters, he thought, giving a quick look over his shoulders at the guards as he ran. This place is already trashed. "Who gives museum guards guns?" Amy shouted from a few paces ahead of them, but she wasn't talking to him. She was speaking to the other man, the one whose long legs were leaving them both in the dust. "In the year 5380, the doctor called back. "Who doesn't?" The three of them spun around a corner, the guards right on their tail, and running towards the big blue box that stuck out like a sore thumb against the brownstone walls. "Oh, thank God," Roy muttered as the doctor snapped his fingers, making the box making the doors of the box swing open like some sort of panicked getaway car. Amy followed the doctor through the doors, and Rory risked one more glance back at the guards before following in suit. He slammed the doors behind him and spun around to face them, the guards on the other side pounding on the wood. Doctor, Roy said, keeping his eyes fixed on the doors and pointing at them with both index fingers. You are positive that will hold? Over the console, the doctor and Amy ignored Rory's question. Instead, the doctor bounded around the circular control panel, hitting buttons and pulling levers until the rotor began pumping up and down with a loud mechanical hum. Amy rested her palms on the console and peeked behind the rotor to look at the doctor. So you have to mess with an artifact every time we visit the museum, she was saying as Roy decided for himself the coast was clear and joined the other two. The doctor was still trolling around the console. That piece was a genuine Aspuki musical instrument, and they were displaying it as a chair, he said, not noticing the murk chirping coming from his jacket pocket. Apparently, neither did Amy. It's not my fault they need a better curator. Is that a phone? Roy interrupted. A phone? The doctor asked, stopping what he was doing to focus on Roy. Then his face lit up. A phone! He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain black smartphone. Its ringtone louder now. A call from our boys on Baker Street, he told them. Amy made her way around the console, folded her arms on her chest. Across her chest. Sherlock? She asked, her eyebrows knitted together in confusion. Never calls us. No, said the doctor. If it was Sherlock, it'd be a text. He answered the phone and put it up to his ear. John, he said into the receiver, a beaming grin on his face. The doctor listened carefully for a few moments before his smile fell and a look of concern passed over his face. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting Amy's and holding her gaze. Rory held his breath. Nothing good ever came from that look, and nothing good ever came from something Sherlock Holmes was tangled up in. Finally, the doctor said in a slow and deliberate tone to the man on the other end, We're on our way. Both cups of tea lay forgotten on the kitchen counter as Dean paced around the small room. John, who was standing behind his chair now, both hands resting on the top frame, watched him. So these weeping angels, Dean said, waving a hand into the air as he stopped pacing and turned to John. What are they? How'd you know about them? About a year ago, people started disappearing, from churches, museums, community centers, basically built-up areas, John explained, answering Dean's second question. At first, it was nothing. Family members complained, but Sherlock thought it was nothing the police couldn't handle. But once you hear enough of these cases, they all start to add up, or at least they did for Sherlock. He decided to take the case, and that's how he met the doctor. He said he deals with things like this all the time. Remember when all those planets were in the sky and those robot things were running about? Well, the doctor said he was the one who sorted it. Yeah, I remember those things, Dean said. They ruined one of my best guns. Never did find out what they were. The doctor said they were aliens from another planet, John answered, pausing for a moment to stare into space and shake his head in near disbelief. So are the angels. Dean cocked his head to the side. Aliens, he thought. That doesn't sound like something a hunter would say. All right, Dean said, not fully believing John's words. Well, how long is it going to take him to get here? Should I meet him halfway or something? John only smirked. Suddenly, a strong breeze swept through the room, kicking up the layers of dust that had formed in the abandoned apartment and making the cold ashes in the fireplace swirl in the air. Dean looked behind him toward the window, but the curtains were billowing out, not in. The wind was coming from inside the room. A large mechanical boom sounded and kept sounding, and Dean looked back at John with wide eyes. The man's own eyes were looking behind Dean, and he followed John's gaze. The silhouette of a large rectangular box with a bright white flashing light on top began fading in and out inside the room, coming more and more into focus each time it reappeared. Finally, it became solid, and both the clanging and wind stopped as quickly as they started. Dean turned his full body around slowly, his jaw clenched as he stood before the large box, which read Police Public Call Box. Dean didn't know what to do for a moment, and he realized that his hand was gripping his trusty Colt in the back of his jeans. The door of the box opened, and Dean prepared himself for anything. Well, maybe not anything. To his surprise, a red-headed woman poked her head out of the door, a broad smile on her face. Well, what are you boys waiting for? Get in here, she called in a Scottish accent, waving Dean and John into the box. We haven't got all day, she chuckled a little, then disappeared back inside, leaving the door ajar. Dean stood shell-shocked, confused, panicked even, and he slowly turned his head to John for confirmation. John had a small, amused smirk on his face as he passed Dean and nodded toward the box. Better do as she says, he advised Dean. He doesn't like to wait. He, too, disappeared into the box. Dean looked wildly around the apartment, his eyes flashing to the door. He didn't like this, not one bit, and every instinct told him to get the hell out of there. But that wouldn't help him get Sam back. He didn't have a choice. He looked back at the box, shrugged a bit, and muttered, what the hell? When he passed through the doorway, he expected to find a small, cramped space, but what he got was quite different. He was met with an entire room, orange and green in color, with a strange-looking control deck that appeared to be made out of old houseware appliances. His yellow-flecked eyes went wide as they scanned the rest of the interior. On the edges of the room were two grated stairwells that seemed to lead to other rooms. There was a soft humming sound, like engines. Dean likened it to something he saw in Star Trek as a kid, but this wasn't a TV show, and Dean wasn't a kid anymore. He gaped and raised his index finger and pointed slightly upwards, not sure whether to focus on the impossible interior of the box, or on the four amusing-looking faces staring back at him. No, he decided, doubling back and rushing out of the box. He took a look at the outside again, wondering if his eyes deceived him the first time. And it really was a massive craft that had just landed in John's living room. Nothing had changed. It was still the same box. What the? Dean trailed off, gulping hard as he looked back at the doors into the box. Okay, he thought, trying to process it all. So, aliens. He didn't know if he was a glutton for punishment or if he was just insane, but he had to see that again. Full speed ahead, he busted through the doors and allowed them to swing shut behind them. The others were waiting for him. There was John, and next to him was the beautiful red-headed woman that had invited them in. Dean expected something spacier, but instead she was dressed in a mini jean skirt, tights, and a regular tank top and jacket. Behind her was a small man with a rather large nose for his long face, and with spiky hair. He, too, was wearing contemporary clothes. Then there was an oddly handsome young man, who looked like he rolled out of someone's grandpa's closet, leaning against the console and apparently too busy text messaging to give Dean the time of day. Dean took another sweep looking around. Oh, Sammy, if you were here, you would have been having a total nerd out, he thought aloud. Sammy, the brown-haired man echoed loudly, shoving the phone into his pocket and standing upright. When he walked closer to Dean, he seemed to flutter. I'm assuming that's your brother. The missing one? Yeah, Dean spoke, remembering that he had that ability. I was told that you could help with Dean waved his hand, searching for the right word. The Weeping Angels, the man offered, turning towards a monitor above the console. John told me all about it over the phone. Didn't you, Dr. Watson? John joined him over at the console. So did the others. Dean, realizing this was the thing to do, did the same. Yes, over in Oak Grove, Oregon, apparently, the man who Dean assumed was the doctor said, seeming to speak to no one and everyone at the same time. It's funny, Dayton broke in, staring at the doctor like he was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. I was expecting someone older. The doctor caught Dean's eye and grinned. Oh, don't get him started, the woman said airily, turning to Dean and offering him her slender, manicured hand. I'm Amy. Dean shook her hand and grinned handsomely. Damn, what I wouldn't do to her, he thought. But what he said was, I'm Dean. Amy gave him a flirty smile and batted her eyes. And I'm Roy, said the other man, cutting in from behind Amy, her husband. Dean's face fell, and he let go of Amy's hand. Oh, he said shortly, trying to hide his disappointment by smiling at Roy. Hi. He turned back to the doctor. So, can you help, friend Sam? The doctor looked at him solemnly. Do you know what a weeping angel is? He said after a pause, but didn't wait for an answer. Me neither. No one does. They're one of the most ancient creatures in the universe, with the ability to place people out of time. They can literally feed off of a person's entire life. The life they would have lived, the time they would have had, by placing them somewhere else in history with a single touch. They're deadly and fast and absolute. His gaze didn't leave Dean's the entire time he spoke. And their victims are nearly impossible to trace, he finished, saying what Dean had feared, but would not accept. Oh, you're going to trace Sam, he said sternly, daring the doctor to tell him otherwise. We're going to find him. Do you understand me? I didn't come all the way to London for you to tell me different. The doctor looked at him with compassion in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said. There's nothing I can do. Dean opened his mouth to say something, but it was John who spoke first. Doctor, he said patiently, and everyone's eyes fell on him. You've got one of the most magnificent machines in the world, capable of finding out any bit of information in history. Surely you can find a record of this man. The man was rational. Dean liked him. He looked at John and nodded a silent thank you. John returned his gaze, then looked back at the doctor, who appeared to be thinking. Perhaps, he said at last. I can narrow it down, find the general time he landed in, give or take a few years, provided he landed in an era when records were kept. What's his name? Sam. Sam Winchester. Maybe just Sam. The doctor turned back to the monitor. This may take a few moments, he said absently. Nice work, John. Learned from the best, he nodded. It's what Sherlock would have suggested. Ah, where is old Sherlock anyways? Amy asked. Busy out solving crimes, cleaning up the streets of London? John said nothing. He looked down to the floor, and this made Amy's smile fall. John? She said in a worried tone. He's dead, the doctor said, his voice solemn again as he eyed John. Amy's eyes shot back and forth between the two men before grabbing at Rory for comfort. John nodded. A suicide, like you said. I have every record at my fingertips. They said he was a fake, that he made all of it up. He saw the cold look in John's eyes. You don't agree? Do you? John said sharply. Of course not. You make some strong arguments on your blog, spreading the word to anyone who will listen to you. Sherlock Holmes was not a liar. Good for you. Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like many people are listening anymore, John said, clearing his throat. It's been months. Yesterday's news? People have moved on. Yes, well, Brangelia is engaged now, the doctor grinned. John did not. I've been trying to get on with my life. Pack up the flat, move into a new one. Go on dates, John said. The doctor nodded. It's what he would have wanted, he said. No, it's not, John said instantly in an airy voice. No, it's not, the doctor agreed in the same tone. But still, it's not all about Sherlock, John said, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. Too bad, it's what I want. The doctor nodded again, but before he could say anything else, a noise came from the monitor. Ah! Now, let's see where Sam is, he said happily, rubbing his palms together and looking back towards the monitor. Dean eagerly tried to read what it said over his shoulder, but all it showed were circles and lines. However, from the way the doctor's smile faded, he knew it was good news. No records, the doctor said softly, facing Dean but not looking him in the eyes. I'm sorry. He's lost. Chapter 4. Present-day England, August 23rd, 463. Sam came to with a raging headache. He felt like he'd been hit over the head with a boulder, and his spine was aching for some reason. Dean, he groaned, opening his eyes and squinting in the sunlight. Where the hell am I, he thought. Reaching under his back and pulling out a splintered wooden pole, he looked up into the side, seeing the broken remnants of an old wooden fence that he had apparently fallen right in the middle of. That would explain the backache, anyway. He felt a presence next to him and heard a loud snort as a large, dirty pig started sniffing his ear. He groaned, shooing the peg away, and sat up, trying his best to get his bearings. He looked around his new surroundings. They contained mostly mud, more of the same fence on the other side of the modest property, and a small stone hut a few feet away. Ah, I am definitely not an organ anymore, he thought aloud, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palms and accidentally spreading fresh mud all over his face. He tried shaking the mud off his hands to no avail. Here, here, Sam heard a woman shout, and looked around. A small woman in what looked like an old, raggedy peasant dress was running towards him through the fence, a shaking figure outstretched in Sam's direction. Behind her followed 3 large men, all in chainmail and red tunics with a golden dragon embroidered on the chest. Sam blinked in confusion. Am I at the Renaissance Fair? He asked inwardly. The men unsheathed 3 large, polished swords and run past the women towards Sam. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Sam yelled, putting his arms up in a way that suggested he meant them no harm, and scrambled to his feet. The men kept their weapons trained on Sam, and he briefly looked around for his rifle, but found no sign of it. Can I help you? He said instead, his confusion leaking into his voice. I told you, he appeared out of nowhere and broke my fence, the woman yelled from behind the men, still shaking and eyeing Sam like he was the monster that crawled out from the closet. Sam noticed that she spoke in a British accent. Oh, no, Sam said apologetically, trying to understand. I didn't mean to break your fence. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not really sure what's going on. See, a minute ago I was in Oregon with my brother and now... Oregon? One of the men interrupted, jabbing his sword forward and making Sam stumble back. Is that in Lot's kingdom? What? Sam asked, wrinkling his nose. He noticed a modest crowd forming around the perimeter of the fence. All men, women, and children with dirty faces, wearing rags, all of them looking at Sam with fear in their eyes. The king will want to see this, said another man. Bring him to the king. Let him be judged, the woman shouted, and the people in the crowd began echoing her. Soon it became a chant. One of the men with the swords grabbed Sam's arms and forced them behind his back. "Hey!" Sam yelled, struggling against the man's grip. One of the others handed the first a small, heavy chain, and he tightened it around Sam's wrist. Then he picked up his sword and touched the tip to Sam's back, daring him to escape. "Can someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" Sam bellowed, not expecting an answer from the angry faces of the mob. While one man stayed in the back of Sam, his sword still drawn. The others grabbed his arm on either side and hustled him forward. Sam clenched his jaw and looked around wildly, his eyes searching the muddy, unpaved streets, the stone and straw huts, the wooden horse-drawn wagons, and the medieval clothes of the people. He gulped and twisted his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up, trying to convince himself that this was all just some crazy dream. When he opened his eyes again, he looked up the hill at the mighty castle looming in the distance. Arthur wore a look of utter disgust on his face as he eyed the statue up and down. "But why is it crying?" he asked for the second time in 5 minutes, and Merlin had half a mind to bash the king's head in. Alban be damned. "I don't know," he said, popping his head up to look at Arthur from the other side of the statue. "I didn't sculpt it. And it's not so bad, once you get used to it." Arthur rolled his eyes. "Who is it from?" "Queen Annis," said Merlin, his eyes searching the throne room for a proper spot to place the eyesore. Preferably somewhere out of the way. He noticed a vacant area near one of the large pillars that lined the room and began the laborious task of pushing the statue towards it. "I thought you'd have a little more taste than this," Arthur said with an exasperated sigh and waved his hand. "Very well, send out a messenger. Have him express my deepest gratitude." "Already done," said Merlin, too busy heaving the statue in the right direction to notice the sarcasm in the king's tone. "Good," said Arthur shortly. "Good to know you're sitting on your backside all day." Merlin let this slide, as he usually did with Arthur's insults. "She meant it as a wedding present," he said instead, getting back on topic. Arthur crinkled his nose and furrowed his brow. "The wedding was months ago," he pointed out, watching as Merlin struggled to drag the statue, but making no attempt to aid him. "Well," Merlin grunted, "there are half a dozen of them. They must have taken some time to make." "Ah!" He stood up straight, having placed the statue in its new home, and put his hands on his hips and smiled at his handiwork. Taking the time to soak in the statue, he realized it really was quite hideous. It was clearly made of some kind of large gray stone found in the forest, and carved to resemble an angel, her hands covering her eyes in sadness. Hardly a gift for a happy occasion, Merlin thought. Along with this one came 5 others, all identical to the next. Half a dozen. How did they even get them here from Annis' kingdom? Merlin heard Arthur say from behind him, and when he turned around, he saw the king had taken a seat on his throne. "They arrived this morning. It took about 20 of the queen's maids to carry them here by wheelbarrow," the servant said, but quickly realized that Arthur wasn't paying him the least bit of attention. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, and Merlin quickly turned his head over his shoulder to follow Arthur's gaze. Outside the open doorway of the grand entrance, Merlin noticed a small woman in a clean, white servant's dress. Her fair skin appeared almost as pale and sickly as her attire. She wore on her head a knitted hairband of the same way. In fact, the only bit of color on the woman was her striking blue eyes. She stood unmoving in the entrance, and the guards posed at the doorway, just feet away from her, didn't even seem to register her presence. Slowly she turned away and continued down the great corridor, silent as a ghost. "Speaking of the queen's maids," Merlin muttered under his breath. "At least the statues aren't the only thing that make my skin crawl," Arthur said, the expression of distaste forming on his face once more. "I know I've given them my hospitality for as long as need be, but for exactly how long are they planning on staying?" "Just for a few days, Arthur." Merlin turned his head towards the king again. "They've insisted on staying until the queen comes back. Something about getting her approval of the statues." Arthur groaned. If only Genevieve and Elian hadn't ridden out to their mother's burial site. "Missing her already?" Merlin teased, a playful smile forming on his face. But it quickly fell away as he saw Arthur drumming irritably on the arm of his throne. "Oh, the grave is only in one of the outlying villages. She should be home in a few days' time. Don't look so worried. You've sent all your best men to look after her." "Don't you have some polishing to do?" Arthur snapped impatiently. Merlin dropped his shoulders in defeat and turned to exit the throne room without another word. He should have known better than to pry. Arthur was never one to talk about his feelings, and Merlin assumed his worry for Gwen would be no different. Still, it was times like this that the gap in Merlin and Arthur's relationship was most evident. Each time Merlin tried to get close to the king, he would be yelled at or ordered to do another mindless chore. For two people whose so-called destinies were so intertwined, Merlin sometimes wishes things had been different, that the two could be equals instead of a servant and master, that they could be friends. "Wait, Merlin," Arthur said, his voice softer than before. Merlin stopped walking and spun around, his eyes meeting Arthur's and holding his gaze for some time. Merlin allowed himself to hope that Arthur was about to open up. "Does that thing have to stay in here?" Arthur said at last, the softness out of his voice once more, and as he pointed a gloved finger towards the statue. Merlin let out a sigh and thought, "I don't know what I expected." "Where would you like me to put it, sire?" Arthur shrugged and shook his head impatiently. "I don't know, the courtyard?" "There are already two in the courtyard," Merlin informed him, trying not to let his agitation show in his voice. "Anywhere then, just get it out of here." Arthur made no attempt to mask his own frustration. "All right then." Merlin walked towards the statue, pressed his lean body up against it, and wrapped his arms around it, trying to get it to budge. "I'll just put it in your chambers." "Merlin!" Before either of them could say another word, a guard rushed through the doors, past the ones posted outside, and hurriedly kneeled before the king. "Sire," said the guard breathlessly. There was enough panic in his voice to catch Merlin's attention. "A matter has arisen that requires your immediate attention." "What is it?" Arthur asked, standing up from his throne and pulling off his long red cape. There was an edge in his voice that hadn't been there before. It was the voice of a leader. "Sire, a man has been arrested in the lower town," the guard explained. "For what?" "He appeared in a woman's hut, my lord. She says he came out of thin air," the guard went on. From across the room, Merlin had to swallow his panic. His eyes shot over to Arthur, who wore a mixed look of anger and memory on his face. That look hit Merlin like a ton of bricks. The guard finished. He suspected of practicing magic. Merlin trailed after Arthur, careful to stay a few steps in front of the dozen or so guards that followed them. When they reached the courtyard, Arthur hustled halfway down the elaborate stone steps. Merlin and the guards stayed a few steps behind him out of respect. Looking out into the square, Merlin saw a crowd had formed near the walls, each commander trying to get a good look at what was going on, but not daring to get too close to the slew of armored guards that now stood before their king. With them, they had in change the largest man Merlin had ever seen, even larger and more muscular than Percival, in very strange clothes. "Sire," one of the guards that had escorted the prisoner stepped forward, genuflect and rose once Arthur gestured him to do so. "We've captured this man in the lower town for the forbidden use of magic." Merlin looked at Arthur out of the corner of his eye, trying to gauge his reaction, but couldn't get a good enough look. Then his eyes rested back on the large man. Merlin could see the panic and confusion in his eyes as he gave a hard swallow. "I've been told a woman witnessed this," Arthur said, his powerful voice echoing around the courtyard. "Where is she?" The guards parted, and a small, brown-haired peasant woman came to the front. "It was I, my lord," she said in a low tone, her eyes at her feet. "Do you have any proof of this?" The woman looked up. "Yes, sire," she said. "I was tending to my crops when he appeared from nowhere. He fell backward and broke my fence. The animals ran loose in panic." Arthur looked towards the guards for confirmation. "It's true, sire," the one said. Merlin had Arthur let out a heavy sigh before turning to the prisoner and saying, "What is your name?" "Me?" The man started, standing a little taller and blinking wildly as he looked at the king. Sam Winchester." "Sam Winchester, you are aware that the use of magic is forbidden by law under the penalty of death?" Arthur said sternly. Merlin had heard those words hundreds of times, but they still made his stomach turn. "What? No," Sam said, the panic in his voice rising. He let out a nervous chuckle. "To be honest, I don't even really know where I am." Arthur shifted around slightly and gave a pause, no doubt wondering how a man could be in Camelot and not know it. "You're in the city of Camelot," he said patiently, regardlessly. For a moment, Sam looked stunned. "What?" he said, pushing his head further, his mouth ajar. "Do you confess to these crimes?" Arthur asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Sam stammered, trying to regain his composure. "No, listen." "Very well," Arthur interrupted, a wave with his hand, uninterested in anything else the man had to say. "Take him to the dungeons." Merlin's eyes widened, his mouth fell open. Surely a broken fence and some escaped pigs weren't enough to condemn a man to death. Arthur, he began, trying to reason with the king, when no one else would. Shut up, Merlin, Arthur snapped, hardly turning his head. In the meantime, the guards once again advanced on the men, and he attempted to struggle against them. Wait, you don't understand! Sam tried calling over the chair and jeering from the crowd. It took 5 guards to restrain him, 2 with their arms wrapped under his, as they bullied him towards the castle's dungeons. Merlin watched the struggles until it was out of sight, then turned his eyes to Arthur, who had his jaw clenched tightly and his eyes averted to the cobblestones. Arthur seemed particularly more irritable than usual for the rest of the day, and Merlin tried his best to keep all his thoughts to himself. In order to not slip up, he had taken to total silence. As he made up the king's bed and fetched his dinner, an innocent man was rotting in jail, awaiting his death. Perhaps he did have magic, perhaps not. Either way, he was innocent in Merlin's eyes. By the time he slammed Arthur's plate of roast chicken down in front of them, Merlin had decided that he must break the man out of jail. How? He did not know, but he was sure a simple talk with Gaius would help him come up with a plan. Is something the matter, Merlin? Merlin, Arthur said, wiping off the pieces of mashed potatoes that flew onto his shirt when Merlin had slammed the plate down. With me? No. Merlin responded curtly, busying himself with drawing the curtains. I'm not the one in the dungeons. He would probably regret saying this later, but he couldn't contain his thoughts any longer. Arthur gave a sigh and tossed his napkin on his plates of untouched food. He's guilty of using magic, Merlin, Arthur said heavily. Merlin spun around to face him. He's guilty of breaking a fence, at the very least, he retorted, a bite in his tone. If I had set him free in front of half the city, the people would see me as unfit to be their king. Worse, it would be as good as granting sorcerers permission to use magic to overthrow Camelot. Arthur tried as an excuse. People would live in a constant state of fear. You're wrong, Merlin said. The people would see you as merciful. Those who practice magic in other lands would respect you. That man didn't even know where he was. I can't go against the law for one man. You're the king. You have the power to change the law. I don't expect you to understand, Arthur said, getting up from the table and walking towards his servant. He no longer looked angry, just tired. I've seen the evils of magic. It ruins my family, killed my parents, taken Morgana over. Arthur swallowed hard and broke eye contact. At that moment, Merlin realized that he didn't want to send the man to death. Merlin even thought for a second that Arthur didn't fully believe his own words. I've got to protect the kingdom from it, Arthur went on. For my people, for the future of my family, I cannot take any risks. Merlin licked his lips and bent his neck, trying to regain eye contact with Arthur. Even if those risks could lead to peace, he said softly, knowing it would be in vain. Arthur looked back at his food on the table. Take the food to the kitchen and go back to your chambers, Merlin. He changed the subject. Then he disappeared behind the changing screen. Merlin sighed and rolled his head back to look at the ceiling, the familiar sensation of dejection pulling at his heartstrings. Arthur had given him no choice. He had to free Sam Winchester himself. Chapter 5. Sam heaved at the bars on the window, making loose bits of stone tumble down the wall and onto the dirt floor. He'd been working at tearing them off for at least 15 minutes now, but he knew that even if he did manage to free the bars, the window was probably too small for him to squeeze through. He just thought it was worth a shot. After all, it was his only option. He didn't have anything to pick a lock on the main cell bars. Anything that would work, he'd left back in 2012. He didn't even have his rifle. He gave a loud grunt and his hand slipped off the bars, making him stumble backwards and crash down on the ground. Great, he muttered, and staring up at the bright moon through the window, wiping the sweat off his forehead with his sleeves. Okay, Sam, he thought aloud in a whisper. Think. He was in Camelot, that much he knew. He didn't believe it, but he was there anyways. Under any other circumstance, he would have been overjoyed. Like someone in pretty much the whole world, Sam had heard dozens of stories of King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot. He even remembered Jess taking a full course on the myths back at Stanford. If only he had paid more attention to them. But who could blame him? He never in a million years thought they were true. In fact, he was pretty sure every historian and scholar had disapproved the legends. Well, those are the same guys who say there's no such thing as werewolves, he thought. Camelot, he muttered, giving a shocked shrug. I'm going to die in Camelot. If he didn't think fast, he'd be dead by the morning. The small window in his cell gave him the perfect view of the town center, where the servants had set up a stake just for him. Maybe it was time for Plan B. which involved getting the guards' attention, knocking them out, and then making a run for it. It was destined to fail, but Sam was banking on the fact that his luck couldn't possibly get any worse. He brought himself to his feet and walked over to the cell door, wrapping his hands around the bars and poking his nose through the other side. "Hey!" he shouted, trying to attract the attention of the guards. He listened out, but didn't hear anyone. "Hey, can I get some water?" Again, no one answered. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall swung open, and Sam prepared himself to pounce. But instead of a guard, a small, slender man with raven black hair and a red scarf tied around his neck came into view. Sam thought he recognized him as the man who was standing next to the king at his makeshift trial. "Shh, are you trying to get us both killed?" he hissed when he got to the cell. He looked around to make sure no one was there, reached into his pocket, and produced a metal key. Sam looked at it with hopeful eyes. He wanted to kiss Merlin, but this was all too good to be true. "Wait, didn't you work for the king?" he said, reality hitting him like a ton of bricks. Was this man sent to take Sam to his death now? Was he out of time already? "I'm his servant," Merlin said, an echo of pride in his words, pushing the key into the lock and opening the cell door. Sam eyed him unsurely. "Are you coming or not?" Merlin said hastily. "I've distracted the guards, but they'll be back any minute. We've got to get you out of here." Sam wasn't about to question his luck. "Sounds good to me," he said, and followed Merlin out of the cell and down the corridor, in the opposite direction from where Merlin came. After a minute or two of walking in darkness, they reached a small gate through which the moonlight was pouring into. "Stand back," Merlin advised, and held up his hand to the gate. Sam knitted his eyebrows together in confusion for a second, before he heard Merlin say, "Toss spring." The side of the gate sparked, and it fell to the grass below. Merlin turned to Sam and shrugged innocently. Sam looked back at him with an amazed smile. "Now I get it," he said, and slapped Merlin on the shoulder. "Your secret's safe with me." In the distance, a loud bell began to echo through the city. Merlin looked up in panic. Neither of us is safe unless we get out of here soon," he said, and took off towards the forest. Sam followed close behind. Sam was led to a small hut in a clearing in the middle of the forest. He could no longer hear the warning bells echoing in the wind, and the silhouette of Camelot was barely visible in the distance. Sam's feet ached from running so far for so long, but he was relieved to be out of harm's way. Admittedly, he was partly depressed that he wasn't able to knock 2 coconuts together on the way out of the city. He sat down heavily on one of the flimsy chairs next to the rotting wooden table and felt it creak under his weight. Clearly, this hut hadn't been used for a long time. Merlin seemed to know exactly where he was going on their way there. "So, Sam started, watching his new friend light up the fire pit in the middle of the room with magic, and close the curtains for good measure, then sat down in a chair across from Sam. "Thanks. Well, I couldn't just sit back and let an innocent man die," he said in return. Sam could see how unsettled the man was. His eyes were averted to the table as he picked at its loose splinters with his long, slender fingers. "You should be safe here," he went on. "The guards will never come farthest up. They'll assume you headed for the caves and get yourself eaten by a wildren." There was a pause, then Sam leaned forward and said, "Hey, what's with the whole condemning sorcerers to death thing, anyway? I mean, I thought Camelot was supposed to be all gung-ho with magic." He had a smirk on his face, now that he was home free, well, or at least from the prison, and able to enjoy the wonder around his surroundings. Merlin snorted a laugh. "I wish. It would certainly make my life a lot easier." "Yeah, but King Arthur, he's impossible!" Sam exclaimed, sitting back at running a hand in his hair. "I mean, that's crazy, you know," he stammered. "Well, I guess you don't know, because you're his servant and all. This is just a normal day for you." "No, believe me, I know how impossible Arthur can be," Merlin laughed, shaking his head softly. Sam laughed too. "I'm just waiting for some old guy with a long beard to come out of the forest and tell me he's Merlin." Sam saw the other man stop laughing and gave a puzzled look. "Well, that certainly would be a trick. I'm Merlin," he said, now looking at Sam suspiciously. Sam was awe-stricken again, like he had been in a courtyard when he'd first learned where and when he was. "Who are you?" Sam asked, as though he was seeing Sam for the first time. "Why are you dressed like that? How did you not know you were in Camelot?" The smile fell from Sam's face, and he sighed. "It's a long story," he admitted. "I'm not really from around here. And where I came from, none of this even exists. It's all just a myth." He seemed to be thinking aloud rather than speaking now. "But I believe... Wait, no. But I have to get back. Dean, my brother, he'll be looking for me by now. I can't leave him there alone." He took out his phone from his pocket and lit up the home screen. "No service," he said, flipping the phone over his hand. "I kind of figured." "What is that?" Merlin asked, trying to get a better look at it from across the table. "Nothing," Sam said coyly, shoving the black piece into his pocket. "It won't help me get back anyways." He stood up from his chair and began pacing. "And it's not like I can tie up my ruby shoes together and say there's no place like home either." "What?" Sam had to remind himself that there was, in fact, a time when that movie didn't exist, and he was in it. He stopped pacing and blew out his cheeks. Never mind. He sat back down, feeling as hopeless and defeated as he did when he was stuck in that cell. "You talk like no one I've ever met before," Merlin said, still eyeing Sam up and down, but now in a fascinated way. "I just can't figure it out. You're not from any of the 5 kingdoms. You don't even look like you come from this world." Sam half laughed, half scoffed. "I bet he's not the first to say that about Americans," he thought, and then said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. But I gotta get back there. There's something I gotta do, and my brother can't do it without me." Merlin looked down and nodded gently, almost as though he knew exactly what Sam was saying. "If that's true, then you'll get back to him," he said. "How'd you know?" Merlin shrugged. "Because he needs you." "You mean like King Arthur needs you?" Merlin's eyes shot up to Sam at these words. To change his mind about magic? It was a guess, but judging by the look on Merlin's face, it was a good one. Merlin nodded slowly. "It's my destiny." Sam smiled bitterly at this and nodded his head. "Yeah, trust me, kid. Destiny isn't all it's cracked up to be." Merlin looked hurt by this, but then his face twisted into a smirk. "Well, Arthur is a total dollop head," he said with a laugh. "He won't give me a moment's peace." He tapped his finger on the tabletop pointedly, but the smile was still in his face and in his voice. Sam couldn't help but chuckle along. The man's laugh was infectious. "It's always Merlin do this, Merlin do that. Even today, he had me lugging about the new statues he receives as a gift. Because he can't stand looking at them. Not that I blame him. I don't understand why anyone would waste their time carving 6 statues of crying angels." Sam's face fell and his eyes went wide. "What did you just say?" Merlin pulled a face and shook his head. "How Arthur doesn't do a thing for himself? No, the thing about the statues. Crying angels?" He gestured with his hands. "Weeping angels? I don't see how." Sam wasn't listening anymore. His mind was too busy reeling. He stood up and began to pace again, hardly aware of how attentively Merlin was watching him. "Weeping angels here, and weeping angels in Oregon," he thought. "This has to mean something." He had to get through to Dean, but how could he send a message that would last over 15 centuries? Then an idea struck him, the same way anything from the past gets to the future. Sam spun around on his heels to face Merlin. "I need to get a message to my brother," he told him, "and I'm going to need your help." "What do you mean, he's lost?" Dean barked, not allowing his worry to show in his voice. Anger. He'd get angry instead. "He can't just be lost. He's got a job to do." "Maybe a name is too broad," Roy spoke up. Maybe you need something more specific." "Specific? Like a code word?" John suggested. "A code word. You two should really make a code word," said Emmy. "We have one." Dean looked back at her, his anger subsiding. "It's Funky Town." She raised an eyebrow painfully and folded her arms across her chest. Dean looked down embarrassed and forced an unconvincing smirk onto his face. "Sam's idea," he lied sheepishly. She didn't seem to buy it. "No, but he's right," Dean said. "Sam would try to leave a message. He wouldn't just give up. He's smarter than that." He began pacing again and ran his hand down his mouth, and as he thought aloud, "I mean, the guy went to Stanford before I pulled him out and brought him back into the life." Dean stopped and looked as though he just had a moment of realization. "Son of a bitch," he muttered loudly. "What?" Rory nodded. Dean ignored him and spun around to face the doctor. "Scan for the woman in white. It's an urban legend. It was the first hunt me and Sam went on when he left college." "Woman in white," the doctor repeated, and punched it into the console. This search took considerable less amount of time. "Ah, ha! Women in white. There are a few results here, mostly from blogs and ghost stories and things." The doctor pulled a face. "It always comes back to ghost stories with you a lot. You can't see what's right under your noses." "Doc," Dean interrupted. "What does it say?" "Right," the doctor said, getting back on track. "There are a few references to the 1930s, mostly in American folklore. It seems that the oldest known reference was dated back to the late 15th century, where the women in white were carved into a boulder on top of a waterfall in England. It's an old tale from the days of King Arthur." "What?" Dean interrupted, rushing towards the monitor and looking at it, even though he couldn't make heads or tails of the language. He remembered Sam saying something about an Arthurian legend back in Oregon. It couldn't just be a coincidence, could it? "That's it," Dean said, deciding to trust his guts. It had gotten him this far after all. "You're sure?" the doctor asked. There was a beat, and then Dean said unsurely, "Yes, and then what else does it say?" The doctor pulled up an image of the rock, which was apparently in some space museum that Dean couldn't pronounce the name of on the monitor. Thankfully, the words carved into the boulder were plain English. It read, D Woman in Night 82446S. 463S. Dean blinked a few times at the image. The rocks and the letters engraved in it were huge, and if it were on a waterfall like that, like the doctor said, it was probably high up. He knew Sam was tall, but that was pushing it. Still, the message was from Sam, clear as day. Not for the first time. Dean was glad he and his brother knew each other better than anything else. Sam knew Dean would figure out his message. It was unique to them. They were always on the same wavelength, even though they were thousands of years apart. Well, there you go, he said, not wanting to waste any more time. However, Sam got the message in the rock. Dean was sure Sam could explain it later. 4633 it is. Back to medieval times, the doctor said gleefully. Judging by the information given about the boulder, I should be able to land the TARDIS right around the area it was found. He started towards the controls. However, before he could get very far, Rory cut in. No, wait, hold on, he said. The angels are in America now. Shouldn't we be taking care of them first? The doctor waved a question. Oh, don't worry about that. I put my best man on it. His eyes fell on John for a moment. Then he said to him, Are you coming, Dr. Watson? John appeared to be thinking. Then finally he said no, but his eyes were pleading with someone to change his mind. No, sorry, I can't. Why not? The doctor tried not to look hurt. I already told you, John said quickly, and there was a bite to his tone. I'm trying to move on with my life, and Mrs. Hudson is trying to rent this place out to new people, and I've got all the boxes out. I can't be pulled into this every time you land in my flat. Your old flat, the doctor pointed out. John sighed. No, he said again, exasperated. I can't keep pretending. The doctor walked up to him, a grave look in his eyes, and Dean wondered if he was as young as he looked. Have you ever thought you could bring him back? The doctor said softly, half nodding back to the console. You had my number in your mobile all this time. Were you ever tempted to go back to that day, to save him? John looked at the doctor in the eye, a look that told the doctor everything he needed to know. Doctor, I'm not going to pretend I know how any of this works, John said. But I know what you would say. I know what he would say. There would be consequences, wouldn't there? The doctor eyed him for a long moment. Yeah, he jotted the word out, and then said quickly, But you could have at least asked. John looked past the doctor to Amy and Rory, and then to Dean, and nodded his goodbye. Then he looked back at the doctor and nodded again. Doctor, he said. Doctor, the doctor said back, and they all watched as John exited the TARDIS. When the door creaked closed behind John, Dean clapped his hands, trying to bring everyone back into the moment. All right, let's put her in warp drive. The others looked at Dean with bemused faces, and Dean's grin fell. I always wanted to say that, he admitted lamely. John stepped back into 221B and looked around. He heard the metallic clang of the TARDIS as it disappeared into oblivion, but didn't bother to look behind him to watch it go. What's all that noise up here? Mrs. Hudson called, popping her head into the room just as the noise subsided. Honestly, I thought there would be a little peace quiet around here with Sherlock gone and all, she said this airily, with a dismissive wave, as though Sherlock had just gone abroad for a few days and would be back any time now. John let out a soft laugh, and, to his own surprise, it was genuine.